3 boys, 9 gunshots. One father who had been planning it for 8 months. The case of Chad Dorman became one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent years, and the main question still remains open: why? Even the most brutal criminals have the right to a legal defense, but time and again, the actions of defense attorneys create the impression that the killer has more privileges than those he killed. Sometimes, it seems the system works in reverse. In 2016, the Dormans bought a plot of land with a house on the outskirts of Monroe, a quiet town in Ohio with a population of about 15,000. 3 acres of land, a spacious house, the result of many years of hard work by the head of the family. Chad Dorman was 32 years old. He worked in construction, taking on private contracts. His wife, Laura, 34, took care of the home and raised the children. They had 3 children together. At the time of the events, the youngest, Chase, was a toddler. The middle child, Hunter, was slightly older, and the eldest, Clayton, was older still. Also living with the family was Alexis, Laura's daughter from a previous marriage. Chad had accepted the girl as his own and treated her with warmth. She often looked after her younger brothers, picking them up from school and making them snacks. Clayton, too, was mature for his age, a responsible and serious boy. He was trusted to watch over Hunter and Chase when their parents were busy. They all grew up active, loved sports, and were very attached to each other and their parents, especially their mother. Hunter loved baseball and dreamed of becoming a professional. The whole family supported him at his games, sitting in the stands and shouting his name. The boy had a jersey with his number on it, which he wore with pride. Alexis had a close friend, Karen, who spent so much time at the Dorman house that the 3 younger children saw her almost as a relative. She would sleep over and eat dinner with them at the family table. Karen remembered the family as close-knit and welcoming. She loved visiting them. The house always smelled of something delicious, and there was always laughter. From the outside, the Dormans looked like a model family. Neighbors would wave to them when they saw them in the yard. No one saw the cracks. That is precisely what happened next, shocked everyone so deeply. June 15, 2023 was a hot day. The air was thick and sticky. Chad returned from work earlier than usual and started doing chores in the garden. He behaved as he always did. He had lunch, played with the children in the yard, and tinkered with something around the house. The boys ran around him laughing. Then he went inside. According to Laura, her husband went straight to the bedroom. His movements were somewhat mechanical. He looked detached, as if disconnected from reality. He picked up the Bible that always lay on the nightstand and flipped through the pages. His lips moved. He mumbled something under his breath. The woman couldn't make out the words. Then he suggested that he, his wife, and their sons rest together in the bedroom. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. He himself walked over to the gun safe. Laura saw him take out a .22 caliber rifle and begin to load it. His hands moved slowly, methodically. She grew alarmed and asked him not to scare her. There was uncertainty in her voice. She was trying to calm herself. She thought that wild animals had appeared in the yard and her husband wanted to scare them away. It had happened before. Deer, raccoons. Chad replied that he was just joking. He put the rifle back and went with his family to the bedroom. The woman's anxiety did not subside. There was something wrong in his eyes, a kind of emptiness. But she tried not to think the worst, pushing the thoughts away. After some time, everyone fell asleep. The boys breathed softly, huddled together. Chad got up. His movements were silent. He didn't want to wake anyone. He opened the safe again, took the rifle, and returned to the bedroom with the weapon in his hands. Laura woke with an inner jolt. She opened her eyes. She was instantly terrified when she saw the silhouette with the weapon. She didn't have time to understand what was happening, not even time to scream. Her husband shot Hunter. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Laura screamed. The voice was not her own. It was primal, agonized. She told the others to run. She herself rushed to her wounded son. His small body was motionless. She shook him, called his name. Realizing he was gone, she grabbed her phone with trembling hands and called 911. Her fingers could barely hit the buttons. Everything was happening quickly. Seconds stretched and compressed at the same time. Alexis was in the living room at that moment, watching television. Hearing her mother's scream, a sound she had never heard before, she ran into the bedroom. She saw her mother on the floor. She saw Hunter. She saw her stepfather reloading the rifle. His movements were calm, practiced, as if he were at a shooting range. The other two boys ran out of the room, their small feet pattering on the floor. Alexis helped the younger one, Chase, grabbing him under the arms. But she couldn't get to the older one. Clayton was disoriented and ran in another direction. Instinct told him to run anywhere, just to get away. Alexis led the little one out the front door, almost dragging him. Chase was crying, stumbling, but Clayton dashed for the back door. The boy ran toward a field hundreds of feet from the house. The grass was tall and rough under his bare feet. Chad followed. He didn't hurry. He aimed and shot him in the back. Clayton had managed to run several dozen paces when the bullet caught him. He fell face down. He was still alive, screaming, a thin, choking sound. He tried to crawl, digging his fingers into the earth. His father walked up, stood over him, and shot him in the head at point-blank range. From the front yard, Alexis saw all of this with Chase in her arms. The little boy kept asking in a thin voice why Dad was doing this, why Clayton fell. The girl pressed his face to her shoulder so he wouldn't see. She held him tighter and ran toward the road, trying to call for help. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of her chest. But Chad caught up with them. His steps were heavy, measured. He pointed the rifle at Alexis. The barrel was aimed directly at her face. He demanded she let go of her brother. His voice was steady, without emotion. The girl begged him to stop. Words failed her. She couldn't speak properly. But she was forced to obey. There was no other choice. As soon as Chase was on the ground, Chad pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. Dry, empty. The magazine was empty. The father began to reload. His hands moved automatically. Remove the magazine, get the cartridges, insert them. The boy, though very young, did not hesitate. He ran back into the house to his mother, his little legs a blur. Alexis used that second to sprint toward the fire station, several hundred yards down the road. Her bare feet slapped against the asphalt. She felt no pain. A passing driver saw the running girl. Her face was contorted, her hair disheveled. He stopped. As Alexis ran, she screamed that her father was shooting the children in their house. Her voice was hoarse, breathless, and she kept running, not stopping. The man immediately called the police, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. He relayed her words, trying to speak clearly. However, it made little difference by then. Law enforcement already knew what was happening. Laura's first call had come through several minutes earlier. Chad returned to the house with the reloaded rifle. His footsteps echoed in the hallway. Laura was holding Chase in her arms. She was squeezing him so tightly the boy could barely breathe. Her husband demanded she give him their son. He held out his hand. The mother refused, shaking her head, clutching him to her chest. A struggle began. Chad tried to rip the boy away by force, pulling his arm, his clothes. He even bit his wife on the shoulder. His teeth dug into her skin. But she didn't let go, holding on with the desperation of the doomed. She begged him to spare their son, her words jumbled and incoherent. She tried to grab the rifle barrel with her hands, her fingers closing around the cold metal. Chav fired. A bang, a flash. The bullet went through her palm, injuring her thumb. Blood spurted out. The pain was so intense that for a moment everything went dark. Her grip loosened. She couldn't hold on. The father tore his son from her arms, lifted him, and threw him on the floor a few feet from his mother. The boy hit the ground and started to cry. Chad shot him in the head without looking away. Then he went outside and walked toward the field where Clayton lay. He walked slowly, as if in no hurry. Laura tried to help her youngest son. Her hands were slippery with blood, her own and his. She shook him, called his name, though she already knew. Realizing she could do nothing on her own, she called 911 again. She screamed into the phone that she had already called, that help still hadn't arrived. Why was it taking so long? Her husband had shot all 3 of her children. She begged them to come immediately, her voice breaking into a shriek. Chad brought Clayton back, carrying him in his arms, just as he used to when the boy would fall asleep in the car. He laid him on the lawn in front of the house, neatly, almost gently. Then he went back inside. He brought out the other 2 boys. One by one, he laid them out next to each other, in a row. He straightened their clothes. Then he sat on the porch steps, took cigarettes from his pocket, and lit one. He took a deep drag. He began to watch as Laura screamed hysterically, trying to resuscitate the children. The smoke rose up in a thin wisp. A few minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. It was too late. They already knew it on the way. As they had been warned that the crime was committed by the head of the family, they proceeded with caution, weapons drawn. Their pistols were aimed forward. Chad sat on the porch, smoking, staring into space. His gaze was glassy. It seemed he didn't notice anything at all. Not the police, not his wife's screams, not what was happening. Even when the officers ordered him to raise his hands and stand up, he didn't move. He continued to sit there, a cigarette between his fingers. There was no weapon visible in his hands. The rifle lay beside him on the porch. The police cautiously approached, each step measured, ready to open fire at any moment, fingers on the triggers. All this time, Laura was screaming over her blood-soaked boys. She was hysterical, her hair stuck to her tear-streaked face. She didn't even notice her own injury. Blood flowed from her hand, dripping onto the grass. Given the circumstances, the police were struck by Chad's calmness. It wasn't shock, not a stupor, something else. When he finally reacted to their presence, he was unperturbed, even talkative, as if he had run into acquaintances at a store. He told them about his dog, which was lying in the shade under a tree. He told them not to worry. The dog wouldn't bite anyone. He was friendly. He stated that he wouldn't hurt anyone else, that he was sober. He asked to be taken to jail. Obviously, he was aware of what was happening. He understood the consequences. The killer was arrested to the sound of his wife's heart-wrenching screams. Handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists. He did not resist. The medics arrived. Several ambulances, though only one was needed. They pronounced the 3 children dead. There was nothing to be done. All had died from gunshot wounds. Clayton and Chase had been shot in the head at close range and had other injuries. Hunter died from a gunshot to the head. In total, Chad had fired 9 shots. The paramedics worked in silence, their movements automatic. One of them walked over to his vehicle and stood there, staring into nothing. The cold-bloodedness, the suddenness, the brutality, it all turned into a nightmare for everyone who encountered this case. Neighbors came out of their houses, standing in groups, not daring to get closer. Only Laura and Alexis survived. Miraculously, the girl was physically unharmed, not a scratch. Her mother was taken to the hospital. They treated the gunshot wound to her right thumb and stitched it up. The physical trauma was nothing compared to the psychological one. The woman had lost her 3 sons in a matter of minutes. Something inside her broke forever. Chad did it consciously. In his cell, he remained completely calm, not resisting. He made a few strange remarks to the detectives. For instance, he stated with frustration that he shouldn't have shot Laura. That wasn't part of the plan. It happened by accident. He also regretted pointing the weapon at Alexis. That too was unnecessary. But not a word about his 3 murdered sons. For him, it was a routine matter, a necessity. He did, however, recount in detail that his lunch that day had been very tasty. His wife had made fried chicken with potatoes. Now that would be his last good memory of food, he said. The detectives exchanged glances. At a hearing a week and a half after the tragedy, 32-year-old Chad Dorman appeared in court. He sat up straight, his hands on his knees. He stated that he had planned the murders back in October of the previous year. His voice was monotone, without a tremor. According to him, he hadn't slept at all for the last 4 nights. The thoughts of what he had to do were too heavy. He lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The very next day, the first court session was held to address the issues of pretrial detention and bail. The assistant prosecutor outlined the circumstances of the crime and described in detail the brutality of what had happened. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of the secretary's pen. Bail was denied without discussion. It was decided that the killer would remain in custody until the trial. Unlike on the day of his arrest, when Chad had maintained complete composure, he now listened with tears in his eyes. They flowed slowly, and he didn't wipe them away. He said he was sad because of the pain he had caused his family. But he didn't explain why he did it, if he was so sad. Despite the gravity of the situation, the main question had to be answered. What drove a loving father, who was close to his children, to kill his 3 boys? Why did he spare Laura and Alexis when he could have shot them right away? He had enough time and enough ammunition. The survivors themselves couldn't answer these questions. They still don't understand what happened. Laura repeated that she didn't recognize her husband that day. The crime caused a huge public outcry. It attracted the attention of the media, the public, and experts. Cameras were stationed outside the house, and journalists interviewed neighbors. Notably, this was the second serious incident in the county involving the deaths of children. Back in February 2023, a student and his parents died in a family tragedy. One of the adults killed everyone, including himself. The child who died had attended the same school as the Dorman children. A second incident in less than a year caused panic. Parents were afraid to let their children play outside. After the shooting of the 3 boys, crisis counselors were placed at the elementary school, a separate office where anyone could go at any time. This helped those who had lost friends and were left with trauma. 2 fundraisers were organized for the surviving Dormans, one for Alexis and one for her mother. Money came in from strangers across the country. Meanwhile, experts began to analyze possible motives. Psychiatrists identify 5 main categories of parents who kill their children. The first are altruistic killers. They believe they are saving their children from future suffering. Often, these are people planning suicide who decide to take their loved ones with them to spare them from financial problems or social judgment. The logic is distorted, but to them, it is real. But Chad did not kill himself, neither at that moment with a gun in his hands, nor later while in custody. He had plenty of time and opportunity, sheets in his cell, corners. Besides, this didn't explain why his wife and stepdaughter were left alive. If he wanted to spare them from suffering, why not all of them? The second category is parents who see their children as a burden or want to profit from their deaths, insurance, inheritance, a cynical calculation. But the Dormans had no financial problems. Chad worked hard, earned well, and was there for his family. Bills were paid on time, there were no deaths. No insurance policies or wills were taken out on the children. No profit. The third category is abuse that escalates to murder, when cruelty becomes the norm and then crosses a line. But Chad had never been observed being aggressive toward his sons before. No bruises, no complaints from the children, no calls to child protective services. The fourth is spousal revenge. When one parent kills the children to inflict pain on the other, the cruelest form of revenge. But the family's relationship seemed normal, at least on the surface, according to relatives and neighbors. Although some had noticed tension. Law enforcement continued to work on the case, gathering information, so they were not quick to jump to conclusions. The fifth option is psychosis, when a patient suffers from severe disorders and kills without rational motives. Voices in their head, a distorted perception of reality. To place Chad in this category required a comprehensive evaluation. This option seemed the most likely, but there was no definitive answer. But Chad didn't fit neatly into any of the categories. He took a piece from each, but didn't fit completely into any. This sparked a massive discussion on social media and in the news. People formed theories and argued in the comments. Law enforcement analyzed the man's past. He had almost no trouble with the law, only one charge of domestic violence. Curiously, the complaint was filed not by a partner, but by his own father. The case was dropped without charges because the father never appeared in court. He must have changed his mind. Other than that, just a few traffic violations. Speeding, running a red light. Nothing serious. Detectives decided to look into the details of the incident with his father to see if Chad had aggressive tendencies. His father's name was Keith Dorman. In January 2010, he went to the police, claiming his son had attacked and tried to strangle him, hands on his throat, squeezing. But on August 26th of that year, the charges were dropped. Keith simply didn't show up for court. He didn't respond to subpoenas. He later claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a domestic quarrel. Now, detectives had a long conversation with him, recorded on a dictaphone. At the time of his 3 grandsons' deaths, Keith was 59 and living in Florida with his wife. Warmth, the sea, retirement. Notably, despite the tragedy, the father did not hesitate to defend his son. Aside from the questionable strangling incident, Keith believed Chad was not prone to aggression. He defended him, almost aggressively. He told the detectives he wanted to talk to his son personally to understand him, but they weren't allowed to see each other after the arrest. Protocol didn't permit it. Keith described Chad as a good man, a loving husband, a caring father. He gave examples, how he played with the children, built them a playground in the yard. They had seen each other a week before the murder. The father hadn't noticed anything strange. They talked about work, about the weather. Keith believed the cause could only be medical problems or a sudden breakdown, and he eagerly awaited the results of the evaluation. He hoped for an explanation. But not everyone shared this view. The father's words contrasted sharply with the testimony of the Dorman's neighbor. Richard, who lived across the street, told a completely different story, that he often saw Chad lashing out at his family. His voice could be heard even across the street. He would yell so loudly that birds would take flight. He was sure Chad had anger management issues. Chad could lose his temper and scream at his children, his wife, even for no apparent reason. Someone dropped a toy, screaming. His wife asked something wrong, screaming. The neighbor considered him volatile, dangerous. Other neighbors also noted that there had been problems in the marriage recently. Many saw Chad getting angry and lashing out at his loved ones almost daily and with increasing frequency. The atmosphere in the house had changed. He himself was reluctant to comment on it, avoiding conversations. His complaints sometimes sounded unreasonable, seemed far-fetched. He would blame his wife for trivial things. Then, detectives spoke with the main witnesses, Laura and Alexis, but only after the victims had more or less composed themselves. This took several days. The girl recalled a conversation she had with her mother a few months before the murder. It was late evening in the kitchen. Laura said that Chad might start causing problems if he kept drinking. The woman was in despair, her hands shaking, and she was considering divorce. It was the first time she had said the word out loud. Alexis confirmed that her stepfather could abuse alcohol, beer, whiskey, Sometimes you could smell it on him in the morning. What was strange was that the toxicology report after the murder showed a complete absence of alcohol and drugs in his blood. 0. Clean blood. Chad's best friend, Mark, also described him as a troubled man with a harsh, angry temperament. They had known each other for 20 years, since school. Recently, it seemed he was ready to explode at any moment, a coiled spring. However, even he was surprised by such a horrific act. He thought he knew Chad. He was wrong. Mark noticed that Chad became even angrier after Laura first spoke of separating. He was in such a rage, his face turned red. He had voiced his desire for revenge more than once, especially when he was drinking. He said she would regret it, that she couldn't just walk away. Could the triple murder have been revenge against his wife? The cruelest revenge, to kill what she loved most? Why then did he kill his own biological children, but not the woman's daughter from her first marriage? Alexis was older, bigger, but he spared her. Laura herself insisted that she had not openly discussed divorce with him, only hints, innuendos. She kept hoping their relationship would recover. She was trying to save the family for the children's sake. Psychiatric experts suggested it could be related to a distorted perception. Chad didn't consider Alexis his property because he wasn't her father, someone else's blood. But he perceived his sons precisely that way, as his own, his flesh and blood. Therefore, he decided he could dispose of their lives, the right of a father in his understanding. While discussions about motives continued, a week after the tragedy, the prosecution charged Chad with 3 counts of first-degree murder. In all cases, the maximum penalty was provided for, the death penalty under state law. 3 life sentences or lethal injection. Unexpectedly, Chad pleaded not guilty. He stood up in the courtroom, looking straight ahead. The prosecutor stated his intention to seek the death penalty. His voice was firm, convinced. The first preliminary hearings took place in July 2023. The defense team sought a gag order. They believed the details of the case should not be leaked to the media, so that potential jurors would not hear them beforehand and form an opinion. A blank slate, as they said. The court found the arguments reasonable and asked both sides to be cautious when speaking to the press and not to disclose important details. On July 5, 2023, an order was issued completely prohibiting the prosecution and defense from discussing the case with journalists and third parties. There were fines for violations. There were no public documents with details of the triple murder. Everything was under lock and key. Chad continued to plead not guilty on all counts. He sat through the hearings with a stone face. Against the backdrop of his wife's and stepdaughter's testimony, as well as his own earlier confession, this caused public outrage. But from a legal standpoint, it was understandable, a defense tactic. The trial was scheduled to begin in July 2024. But before that, several more stages had to be completed to determine if the defendant was sane and if the death penalty was a lawful punishment. The bureaucracy dragged on for months. The defense attorney worked actively. By September 2023, he had filed 34 motions, stacks of paper. He tried to exclude shocking photos from the crime scene from the case materials, to whitewash the defendant's image, to present him as a victim of circumstances. He pointed out that Chad had not caused any problems in jail. A model inmate, he followed the rules. The defense lawyer was awaiting the results of the psychiatric evaluation. On the other side, several specialists were working. Tests, interviews, analysis. It turned out that on that fateful day, June 15, 2023, Chad had gone to a clinic in a neighboring town at the urging of his mother, who was worried about his condition. She had called him, begging him to go. He had previously described some strange sensations to her. Voices, perhaps. Pressure in his head. However, he did not receive help. He just left without even speaking to the staff. He walked in, stood in the hallway, turned around, and walked out. What stopped him remains unknown. Fear, shame, something else. By 2024, the prosecution was almost certain that the triple murder was committed to cause Laura pain, the maximum, unbearable kind. The defense attorney continued to push for a reduced sentence, the main goal to avoid the death penalty by any means necessary. Now he latched on to violations committed by the police during the arrest. He cited the rudeness of one of the officers and the tightly fastened handcuffs that Chad had complained about. The metal dug into his wrists, leaving marks. Against the backdrop of a triple child murder, these arguments seemed absurd. But the defense insisted that if the man's rights were violated, then evidence could be excluded. Procedural technicalities. The lawyer claimed that Chad's rights were violated repeatedly. During the interrogation, one of the detectives did not fully recite his Miranda rights and did not provide a document to sign. He read them in a simplified oral form. He just skimmed through the points. The lawyer meticulously analyzed the recordings of the 3-hour interrogation. He watched the video dozens of times, taking notes. He tried to latch on to every word from the detectives, the circumstances, the setting, searching for even the smallest flaws. Pauses, intonations, pressure. The defense was fighting for the client's rights. This could help remove some information from the trial and make it harder to secure a conviction. Despite the expert's conclusion that the man was sane, the lawyer was convinced that Chad suffered from conditions that had never been documented, hidden, undiagnosed. He pointed out that Chad looked confused on the interrogation video, sometimes giving unintelligible answers to the detectives. His gaze wandered, his hands trembled. The prosecution explained this confusion as a result of the unusual situation. For most of the interrogation, Chad thought clearly and reacted normally. He answered questions coherently, recalling details. Chad himself, at this stage, claimed he had not confessed and did not remember most of that day. The murder, the arrest, the interrogation. Gaps in memory, black holes. He was sure he suffered from serious illnesses that caused memory problems, amnesia, dissociation. The lawyer emphasized that Chad only answered general questions attentively, about the weather, about work, about the dog. But when the conversation turned to his guilt and the events of the murder, his answers became vague, evasive. For example, the defendant mentioned a lawyer several times. "I need a lawyer. Where's my lawyer?" The detectives interpreted this as an unwillingness to involve a lawyer and a waiver of his right to one. Rhetorical questions. Now, the lawyer argued they were mistaken. The killer had asked for help several times during the interrogation and was denied it, thereby violating his rights. a direct request that went unheard. The defense built its tactic on Chad Dorman's insanity. The entire strategy was built around this. By the spring of 2024, after hearing the defense's motions, the court issued a ruling. The courtroom was full. Everyone was waiting. The court acknowledged that the killer's rights had been violated twice. The first time, when the detective began the interrogation and did not recite the full scope of his constitutional rights. The second time, when the man did not get a lawyer, even after casually asking about one. The information obtained during that part of the interrogation was ruled inadmissible and excluded from the trial, a technical victory for the defense. After this ruling, Chad changed his plea. He stood up in court. Instead of a plea of not guilty, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a new line of defense. The lawyer conducted independent evaluations to identify illnesses. He hired the best specialists he could find. He continued to insist that the man was insane at the time of the massacre of his children. He was not in control of himself. The prosecution had already requested an expert opinion. At that time, it was determined that he was sane. The father was of sound mind, did not kill his wife and stepdaughter, and was aware of what was happening. He was choosing his targets. Furthermore, he had previously admitted that he had conceived of the tragedy back in October 2022, 8 months before the events. He planned it, prepared for it. The latter assertion that he did not remember the killings could also be refuted. During one of his phone calls to his mother, Chad stated that he remembered all the events perfectly and the reason for his actions, though he did not specify what it was. The conversation was recorded. It was obvious to everyone that the man was sane, but the defense was persistent, not giving up. The judge ordered a new psychiatric evaluation, another one, independent. The prosecution continued to argue that Chad deserved the death penalty, adamantly. In early May 2024, the lawyer filed a motion to have the death penalty taken off the table. He had obtained an expert's report, which concluded that the man had a serious mental illness at the moment he picked up the weapon, an acute episode. They found multiple signs that his mental disorder had been progressing for a long time, but no one had sought help from specialized institutions. Years without treatment. They suggested he might have bipolar disorder, manic depressive psychosis. All these evaluations and motions led to the trial being postponed again. The months dragged on. Instead, another preliminary hearing was scheduled for July to resolve all the disagreements. It also had to be determined whether Chad was eligible to avoid the maximum penalty. The answer no longer seemed so clear-cut. Then, new bureaucratic problems intervened. The assigned judge was due to retire before completing all stages: age, health. The new judge needed time to familiarize himself with the case materials. He spent weeks reading the file. The new psychiatric evaluation could undermine the prosecution's position. Now, revenge against Laura seemed a likely motive, even to the prosecution. But the question of sanity remained open. Fog instead of clarity. Of course, they tried to challenge the results. A specialist hired by the prosecution was confident that Chad was completely healthy and sane, a malingerer in his opinion. The defense expert claimed he was in a state of psychosis and could be considered insane. Two opposing viewpoints. The public closely followed the developments, wondering when the trial would finally begin. People wanted justice. They wanted answers. However, it was not destined to happen at all. On August 2, 2024, Chad Dorman pleaded guilty in exchange for 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. A deal. This was done as part of a plea agreement with the prosecution, who feared for the outcome of the case and the possibility that, due to a finding of insanity, the man might avoid prison altogether. Legal risks. Chad thus protected himself and avoided the ultimate punishment, life instead of death. This came as a real blow to all who wanted to see the death penalty as a more fitting punishment for this brutal killer. The disappointment was immense. After all this, family members, as well as Laura and Alexis, who had endured the court proceedings, spoke about their feelings in the courtroom, in front of the cameras. However, even they did not insist on the death penalty after proposals for a plea deal and a life sentence emerged. They were tired of the process and wanted to close this chapter. His stepdaughter stated that she could never forgive Chad. Her voice trembled, and she hopes he gets the punishment he deserves. At the same time, Alexis said through tears that she couldn't just hate him. That would be easier. She is grateful to him for the time when Chad was not sick and sincerely gave all his love. When he built them a swing set, read to them at night, taught them to ride a bike. That man and this killer seemed like 2 different people.